Saturday morning, 9 a.m. I had slept in, made myself breakfast, and taken a slow walk down to the bakery with my key in my pocket. I could hear it before I even opened the door. The kind of noise a place makes when it is falling apart with customers watching. Raised voices, a till beeping wrong, someone in the back shouting about bread trays. Through the glass, I could see a queue of people stretching almost to the door. And behind the counter, a woman I knew from the kitchen, someone who had never worked a register in her life, stabbing at the touch screen with both hands, like she was trying to win an argument with it. And there he was, the owner. In an apron he never wore, face the color of a boiled beetroot, moving between the counter and the back kitchen at a speed I had genuinely never seen from him before. He was making sandwiches, hundreds of them, alone. This was sandwich day, the most chaotic, most stressful, most everyone needs to be here day of the entire month. The day the whole bakery stopped making cakes and pies and pivoted to production sandwiches in bulk, packaged and shipped to businesses across the area. It required every pair of hands they had, every key holder, every trained member of staff. I was the only key holder he had who actually knew what she was doing. And my last day had been yesterday. He looked up and saw me through the glass. Something moved across his face, relief, anger, recognition, all of it at once. I held up the key so he could see it. He made a motion with his head that I could not read and chose not to try to read. I walked in. I put the key on the counter. I waved. He looked away. I walked back out into the Saturday sunshine, and I did not look back once. Subscribe right now, because I was 18 years old and I had just brought a grown man's entire Saturday to its knees without raising a single finger. And the story of how that happened starts 3 weeks earlier, in an apron of my own, learning something important about what it means to give notice to someone who is not listening. I was 18. Not 19 yet, 18. The age where you are officially an adult and practically still figuring out what that means in any real sense. I had just finished school. I needed money for the gap between finishing and whatever came next, which I had not entirely worked out yet. The bakery was hiring. I lived in the same town. It seemed simple. The interview lasted about 10 minutes. The owner, I will not give him a name because he does not deserve one, and also because this town is not enormous and I have no interest in the paperwork that comes with naming. People asked me 3 questions and then told me I could start Monday. The wage was not exciting, but it was acceptable. The hours were manageable. The job was straightforward. Cashier, front of house, occasional back of house support when they were short. It seemed fine. And for the first few days, it was fine. The way things are fine when you are new and have not yet seen what they look like when the novelty has worn off. The bakery smelled good, proper bakery smell, warm sugar and bread, the kind that clings to your clothes and follows you home. The customers were mostly nice. My coworkers were a mixed group, but friendly enough. I learned the till. I learned the menu. I learned where everything lived. And then I started to learn what the owner was actually like. Not all at once. That is never how it happens with people like him. It happened in layers, the way a smell builds in a closed room. So gradual you don't register it until you're already in it. The first layer was the breaks, half hour, for a 10-hour shift, not a typo. He would say it without embarrassment, without softening, like it was a perfectly normal arrangement. 30 minutes to eat, rest, and recover from 10 hours on your feet in a hot building. I was 18 and I did not yet know enough to know that this was not standard. It was only when I mentioned it to people outside the bakery friends, my mom, and watched their faces that I understood the number was wrong. The second layer was the way he spoke about his staff to his friends. He had a particular group of men who came in during the week, always mid-morning, always ordered the same things, always stayed longer than they needed to, and he performed for them. That is the only word I have for it. He performed, and the material of the performance was his employees. Their mistakes, their appearance, their responses to things, presented for laughs while we stood there and absorbed it. He would say something at our expense, and his friends would make the noises friends make, and the thing he said would sit in the air for the rest of the shift. I saw 2 people walk out on their first day. Not on a break, not at the end of a shift. Mid-shift, apron off, keys on the counter, gone. 2 different people, on 2 different occasions, in the 3 weeks I was there. I watched it happen both times from behind the register and I thought, they knew something I am still working out. By week 2, I had worked it out. Every month, on a fixed Saturday, the entire bakery converted. No cakes, no pastries, no counter service in the usual sense. The kitchen became a production line. Hundreds of sandwiches, standard fillings, packaged and labeled, loaded into the van by midday and shipped to corporate clients who had standing orders. It was the most reliable revenue day of the month, and it required, without exception, every member of trained staff. The cashier was especially critical, because while the kitchen was running production, someone still had to manage the front of house. Customers still came in. Retail still happened. The till still needed to function. And the only people trained on that till, at that point in the bakery's staffing history, were the owner and me. I was the key holder for morning openings. That mattered on sandwich day specifically, because the production had to start before the bakery opened to the public, which meant someone with a key had to be there first. That someone was always me. I had done one sandwich day before I gave my notice. One was enough to understand the full shape of it, the physical weight of it, the specific, grinding, airless quality of a 10-hour shift where the pace never drops and the owner is in the building the entire time, because on sandwich day he actually had to work, which put him in a mood that made everything worse. The proximity issue was the worst of it. He had no concept or perhaps no interest in having a concept of what appropriate physical space between a manager and a teenager looks like. He stood too close. When he reached across to correct something I was doing, there was always more contact than the correction required. I told him, multiple times, in different ways, as clearly as I could manage at 18 without the vocabulary or the confidence I would have now, that he was making me uncomfortable. He interrupted me every time, or he looked past me, or he turned the discomfort into a joke. I was not going to do another sandwich day. That was not a vague preference. That was a line I had drawn internally and was not going to move. 3 weeks in, I had been counting. Not because I had arrived with a countdown, I had arrived genuinely trying to make the job work. But there is a specific internal clock that starts running when you are in a place that is wrong for you, and by week 2, it was audible whether I wanted to hear it or not. I asked to speak to him at the end of a shift. He was at the back, wiping down a surface, doing the minimum version of the closing routine he left mostly to staff. I stood at a distance that felt safe, and I told him I was leaving, giving a week's notice. My last day would be Friday of the following week. He put the cloth down.
A week. You're giving me a week's notice. You've been here 3 weeks, and you're giving me a week's notice.
Yes.
You know what that is? That's unprofessional. That's what that is.
He said it with the specific indignation of someone who expected 18-year-olds to treat his bakery like a career. I did not point out that the break policy, the proximity issue, and the public humiliation in front of his friends were also, by some definitions, unprofessional. I just held my position. My last day will be Friday, I said, and I won't be working Saturday. I want to be clear about that. He waved his hand.
We'll sort it out nearer the time.
I did not like that answer. We'll sort it out was not the same as yes, understood, Friday. But I nodded. I went home. I was going to remind him, I told myself, multiple times in the week ahead. I was going to make absolutely sure he understood. I did remind him. That is the part I want to be clear about. I reminded him on Tuesday. I reminded him on Thursday. Both times he responded in ways that suggested the information was entering his ears and not landing anywhere. On Thursday, my second to last day, I asked him directly when he wanted the key back. He talked over me before I had finished the sentence.
Just bring it in at the end of your shift Saturday. End of the shift, key goes back, we're done.
He had just told me my last day was Saturday, the day I had explicitly said I would not be working, 3 times, in the same week. I stood there for a moment. He had already moved on to something else. He was not looking at me. The conversation from his perspective was finished. Something settled in me then, not anger, something quieter and more decisive than anger. The specific calm of a person who has just stopped trying to make someone hear them and has accepted that the hearing was never going to happen. I chose not to correct him. He had told me to bring the key back at the end of my shift Saturday. Saturday it was. My last actual shift. I opened the bakery as normal. I ran the till. I managed the front of house. I trained the kitchen worker, the one who would be on the register the following day in my place, badly, which I had no way to prevent because she had never been trained on it and nobody was going to train her in the 12 hours between my leaving and the bakery opening on as much as I could compress into a working day. She was a good person. She did not deserve what was coming to her on Saturday. That part I genuinely felt bad about and still do, a little. She was caught in the middle of something between me and a man who had stopped listening. At the end of my shift, I did the full closing routine. Every step, every checklist item. I locked up. I set the alarm. I stood outside in the evening air with the key in my hand. I went home. I cooked dinner. I watched something on television. I slept. My alarm was off. No reason to set it. I woke up when I woke up. That sounds small, but I want you to sit inside it for a moment. For 3 weeks, I had been dragging myself out of bed at a time that required an alarm, arriving at a cold bakery, opening up alone, starting a day that was going to ask a great deal of me and give back 30 minutes at lunch. I had been tired in the specific way. You are tired when your body is spending more than it has, and the account is going into the red. That morning, I woke up when my body was done sleeping. No alarm, no cold building, no owner. I made breakfast, proper breakfast, sat at the table, no rush, eggs, toast, coffee that I drank while it was still hot, which sounds like nothing until you have spent weeks drinking coffee and snatched standing up minutes between customers. Around 9, I got dressed. I put the key in my pocket. I walked down to the bakery in the kind of Saturday morning air that is specific to that time of year, cool but not cold, the light doing something generous with the high street windows. I was in no hurry. There was nothing to hurry for. I heard it before I saw it. The cue, the register beeping wrong, the shouting from the back, the compressed chaos of a sandwich day missing its most critical piece. I stood outside the glass for just a moment, long enough to take in the full picture. The kitchen woman behind the counter, completely out of her depth, the customers queuing with the resigned irritation of people who came in for a quick purchase and have somehow ended up in a situation, and him. Red-faced, aproned, running, actually running between the front and the back, making sandwiches he should have had 10 people helping him make. He saw me through the glass. Something crossed his face that I read in under a second and moved on from. I went in. I held up the key. I put it on the counter. I waved. He looked away. I walked out. I did not skip. I did not laugh. I did not do anything that would have looked, from the outside, like a person who had just done something satisfying. I walked home the same way I had walked down. Same streets. Same Saturday morning light. The key was no longer in my pocket, and there was a specific lightness to that, not metaphorical, actual. The physical absence of a small piece of metal that had represented weeks of early mornings and 30-minute lunches, and a man who thought the word unprofessional was his to use about other people. What I felt was mostly clean. Not triumphant. Clean. The feeling of a situation that has resolved itself exactly as it was always going to resolve itself, and of a person who simply stayed out of the way and let it. I had told him my last day was Friday. 3 times. He had not listened. He had given me an instruction, bring the key back at the end of your shift Saturday, and I had followed it. I had done exactly what he asked. He had no one to be angry at except the version of himself who kept interrupting me. That is the thought I carried home. That is the thought I still carry when I think about that walk, which I do sometimes, on days when I need to remember that you do not always have to fight loudly to win clearly. Sometimes you just have to hand in a key. I heard, about 3 months later, that he had sold it. Not from him, from someone who still lived near it, a friend of a friend, the kind of secondhand information that small towns produce naturally. The word was that he had run out of people willing to work there, that the turnover had reached a point where he could not sustain the staffing levels the operation required, that the reputation of the place among the people who had worked there, and the people who knew people who had worked there, had reached critical mass in the way that reputations in small places eventually do. He blamed the workers, apparently, said nobody wanted to work anymore, that young people had no commitment, that the industry was impossible. He did not say anything about 30-minute breaks on 10-hour shifts. He did not say anything about the proximity or the humiliation performances or the 2 people who had walked out mid-shift in 3 weeks. He did not say anything about the teenager he had failed to listen to who had shown up on a Saturday morning specifically to hand back a key. Those parts were not in his version of the story. They rarely are, in people like him. The story he tells himself has him at the center, and the cause always somewhere external. The workers, the industry, the economy, the times. Never the 10-hour shift with 30 minutes off. Never the way he spoke to his staff in front of his friends. Never the fact that he interrupted a girl every time she tried to tell him something was wrong. He sold the bakery. Someone else bought it. I went past it once, a year later, on a visit back to that town. It had new signage, different smell coming through the door, looked quieter, calmer, like a place where people might actually stay. I did not go in, but I noticed. There are things you learn young that stay in you in a way that later lessons do not. Not because youth is especially wise, it is frequently the opposite, but because early experiences settle into the foundation, and the foundation is what everything else is built on. The bakery was not the worst job I have ever had. In terms of pure difficulty, I have had harder. In terms of complexity and responsibility, nothing that came at 18 compares to what came later. But it taught me things at an age when I was still soft enough to let them really land. The first was this: people who interrupt you when you are trying to warn them of something are not people who will respond well when the warning comes true. The instinct, when you are young and still learning how workplaces work, is to keep trying, to repeat yourself, to find a clearer way to say the thing, to assume that if you just find the right words in the right order, the person will hear them. Sometimes they will not hear you, not because your words are wrong, because hearing you would require them to adjust, and adjusting is something they have decided not to do. You can tell those people from the ones who are simply distracted or busy, because the distracted and busy ones apologize in return. The ones who are choosing not to hear you look away, they move on. They give you a different answer to the question you asked. He told me to give the key back Saturday. I had asked about Friday. He gave me a Saturday answer to a Friday question, and that was the tell. He had decided what was convenient and had explained it to me, and the explanation was going to stand regardless of what I said next. The second thing the bakery taught me was that malicious compliance, that phrase I did not have yet at 18, but that describes exactly what I did, is most effective when it is entirely literal. Not slightly off, not exaggerated. Precisely, exactly, to the letter, what was asked. He said Saturday. I showed up Saturday. I had the key. I returned the key. Nothing I did was outside what he had instructed. The force of that, the legal and moral cleanness of it, is the whole thing. You cannot be blamed for following instructions. You can only be blamed for the instructions being wrong, and the instructions were his. The third thing, and this one took years to fully understand, but the seed of it is in that walk home on a Saturday morning. The people who have the least regard for your time are often the people who are most dependent on it. He needed me. He needed my key and my training and my willingness to open up alone and run a till and hold the whole front of house together for 10 hours with 30 minutes off. He needed all of that, and he communicated consistently that he did not value any of it. That was not a contradiction. That was the dynamic. His contempt for my time was possible specifically because my time was indispensable. If he had valued it, he might have had to pay more for it. He would have had to listen. He chose not to listen. And so on a Saturday morning in a town I do not live in anymore, I showed up and gave him exactly what he asked for and left him to his chaos. There is a kind of employer in the hospitality and retail world, the small business owner who treats teenagers and young workers as resources without recourse because they believe the power differential is total, and I want to talk about that directly because the bakery was not unusual. That is what I understood later. After more jobs, more workplaces, more of the working world, the bakery was not a uniquely bad place. It was a fairly representative example of a category. Small business, owner on site, young staff, low wages, high expectations, and an authority figure who had decided that the vulnerability of his employees, their financial need, their inexperience, their tendency to absorb things rather than confront them gave him permission to behave however he liked. The harassment was real. The proximity violations were real. The public humiliation was real. The 30-minute break on a 10-hour shift was a labor violation in many jurisdictions and almost certainly in ours, though I did not know that at 18. The two people who walked out mid-shift were not dramatic or unprofessional. They were people who had done a rapid and accurate cost-benefit analysis and left before the cost got any higher. I stayed 3 weeks and left with a week's notice, which is more than he deserved and more than the situation required. And I left because it was the right professional thing to do, rather than because I owed him anything. And then I gave him one more day, because he asked for it in the only way he knew how, by not listening to me when I said he couldn't have it. The people who work these jobs are not invisible. They are not without recourse. though the recourse is often slow and difficult and requires resources that 18-year-olds do not always have. What they have, always, is the option of not being available, of having a last day that is actually the last day, of following instructions so precisely that the gap between what someone wanted and what they actually asked for becomes impossible to ignore. That gap right there on the counter, in the shape of a key, is the only thing I left behind. If you have ever worn an apron to work, if you have ever run a till, or opened up a loan or worked a shift where the break was 30 minutes and the day was 10 hours and nobody asked whether that was okay, this part is for you. You are not invisible. What you do is not unskilled in any real sense of that word. Running a front of house under pressure, managing a queue while keeping track of the production schedule in the back, holding the customer experience together when everything is going sideways, that is a specific skill that takes time to develop and that not everyone has. He knew this. That is why he kept giving me the key earlier and earlier. That is why, when sandwich day arrived and I wasn't there, the entire Saturday fell apart. The people who treat service workers as replaceable tend to discover, at precisely the worst moment, that the specific person they chose to dismiss was not in fact replaceable, not the category, the specific person. With her specific knowledge of the till, her specific relationships with regulars, her specific understanding of exactly what sandwich day requires and how the production has to flow, he thought he was managing an interchangeable resource. He was managing a person who knew his business better than he was willing to acknowledge, and who left on the day she said she was leaving, and whose absence on Saturday morning was the most accurate possible measure of everything he had refused to see. Know what you are worth, not in an abstract way, in a practical, daily, who actually keeps this working way. And if someone asks you to bring a key back Saturday when your last day is Friday, think carefully about whether to correct them. I am not 18 anymore. I have had other jobs since the bakery. Better jobs mostly, a couple that tested me in different ways. One that I am proud of and that I stayed in for 6 years and that built things in me that I carry into every room I enter now. I have learned, across those years, to ask better questions before I accept a role, to read the first week more carefully, to notice the small things, how someone speaks to the cleaner, how the rota gets communicated, whether the breaks are written anywhere or just promised verbally that tell you the shape of a place before the shape reveals itself. The bakery was my first real workplace experience, and it was not a gentle introduction. But I am not sorry it happened. You learn from the places that ask too much what you are willing to give, and you learn from the places that give too little what you are willing to accept. I learned both things at 18, and I have been adjusting my calibration ever since. I think about that key sometimes, the weight of it in my pocket on that Saturday walk, the moment I put it on the counter and the specific lightness of turning and walking out. It is a small image to carry this far into an adult life, but it is mine, and it is clean. And on the days when I need to remember that doing the right thing for yourself and following instructions to the letter can be exactly the same action, I go back to it. A counter, a key, a wave that was not returned, and a door I walked through without looking back. He said nobody wanted to work anymore. That was his explanation for why the bakery failed. That workers today have no commitment, that young people want everything handed to them, that the industry is impossible. What he meant, though he would never say it this way, was that people stopped accepting what he was offering in exchange for what he was asking. That the workers who came through his doors did the maths 30 minutes, 10 hours, the proximity, the humiliation, the breaks that were not really breaks, and decided the numbers did not add up. That is not a generation problem. That is arithmetic. The people who work these jobs are not asking for the world. They are asking for a break that is long enough to eat in. They are asking for a manager who does not stand too close. They are asking for the basic dignity of being listened to when they say something is wrong. And if you cannot give them that, if you cannot build a place where people feel like more than a resource to be scheduled, then the problem is not that nobody wants to work. The problem is that nobody wants to work for you. He missed that distinction. I put his key on the counter and walked out, and a few months later, he found out what it costs when the person who holds everything together finally decides she has held enough. It costs a bakery, as it turns out. It costs a Saturday. It costs the particular, public, red-faced experience of being in an apron in your own business, making 100 sandwiches alone, while a queue builds to the door, and the only person who could have prevented this is walking home in the Saturday morning sun, free. Subscribe to Office Confession for more stories from the counters and the conference rooms and the walk-in coolers and the car parks and every other place where someone finally decided they had given enough. I will see you next time. Know what you're worth, and always be very clear about what day your last day actually is.